We have Martina Panisi here with us. Hey, Martina.
Hi, Olga. How are you?
Great. How
Hi.
are you? It's great seeing you.
I'm fine. Here is morning. Very excited to be part of this Global Biodiversity Festival. So thank you so much.
Thank you for being with us. Martina is an environmental educator and facilitator in schools and in local communities. And what she does is she highlights in every way possible the value of endemic biodiversity. And the interesting thing about her work is she raises awareness about the need of protection of often unpopular species. So today she's going to speak about the Forest Giants project, the project about the story of a threatened giant land snail in Central Africa. Wow, so you work with snails. Please tell us more.
Yeah, I'm a conservation biologist, and I'm doing actually my PhD at Lisbon University right now. And if I will share the screen so we can start. Yeah. Please tell me if you see it. Everything is okay? Olga?
Yes, we can see your screen. Everything's perfect.
Perfect. So today I want to take you with me in a small journey to the place where I felt in love some years ago. And I'm still working as a conservation biologist there. And at first, I want you to imagine that you were in the middle of a rainforest, and all of a sudden you find these eggs. And I probably think that most of bird enthusiasts will try as sudden as they can to try to identify what type of bird laid these eggs. But what if it wasn't an egg? I think Elga already gave a glimpse of what it may be. The reality is that when I speak with people and I try to explain what I do as a conservation biologist, and I left everything to go to the equator line on some islands and to study and protect giants. They at first look at me and say, okay, but what kind of giants are you studying? Maybe animals, big animals such as whales, or maybe there are elephants on islands? But what if it was a snail? So why in the world study snails? The reality is that every conservationist has its own reasons and motives to do what it does. And for me, it started when I was very young, and I was told as a child that every single living beings, from the smallest to the biggest, have their own importance. They deserve respect because at the end of the day, we all share the same home, which is Earth. And I think something clicked in my mind in that moment, and I started to see the living beings around me in a different way, because all of them, each of them has its own unicity, its own beauty, its own shape and colors. And so I would stare at spider webs, trying to wonder how in the world they are doing this beautiful job in building these structures, or maybe stalking slugs to understand where they were going after a night of feeding. And eventually, growing up and studying as a conservation biologist, I found that I understood that more than 97% of all animal species are invertebrates. These animals that sometimes people don't really pay attention to because they are very different from us. But the most important thing that I understood is that they don't only need to be protected because of their intrinsic beauty, but also because each of them develops some important functions in the ecosystems that are around us. And the same ecosystem we depend on for every day for the natural resources we need as a species, as humans, to survive. So it's all of our interest to get to know them and get to know how to protect them if we also want to ensure us a future. So maybe a few of you know that land snails and slugs are one of the animal groups that were most threatened in the last decades by human activities, mostly because even if they are very slow, and if something is impacting their habitat, they can't really escape very in a high speed. But this is just one reason. Anyway, if we can just imagine the Hawaii wonderful islands where there are hundreds of species of land snails that only exist there, and just a human introduction of one carnivorous species led to the decline of dozens and dozens of species. So what can we do? If it's difficult for us, for me and you that are attending today, that we know the value of nature and why we should protect, if it's difficult to make all the other people understand that biodiversity loss, it's a critical problem and maybe one of the biggest problem of our present, by using species that are very charismatic, big and fluffy, such as big mammals like tigers or lions, and animals that as well have a very high importance, but how to do with invertebrates that not all of us are familiarized. And the reality is that since we are little, even if we can get curious about atypical animals, instinctively we will try to it's easier for us to relate to animals that are anatomically or behaviorally more similar to us, such as big mammals, because we can create empathy easily. So what can we do with invertebrates? Even if they are so different from us, we should take the opportunity not to fear them, but to try to understand more about them and about their characteristics. And I like to think that every species that is disappearing is just waiting for somebody that start to be interested to its story, start to listen to its story, start to be part of it, or start to tell the story. And that is why I want to tell you the story of these giants. So to tell you the story of these giants, we have to go in the Gulf of Guinea, on the equator line in Central Africa. And there we can find two small islands that form the Republic of São Tomé and Príncipe, which is the second smallest African country. And these islands are volcanic islands, and when they originated, it starts to be they were always separated from the continent during millions of years. And the species that eventually got there, they were separated from the other species on the continent, so they started to become unique. And that is why there is a high number of unique species that only exist there. And this is these islands are part of one of the biodiversity hotspots worldwide. That are areas that have a high conservation value because there are a high number of unique species at the same time they are threatened. So at the first time when people discovered these islands was very late. It was the end of the 15th centuries, and people, when they arrived there, they weren't aware about the wonders of the biodiversity that were there and the uniqueness. So they started to rapidly modify the landscape, and if these islands were almost totally covered by forests, they started to modify this, and currently just 1/3 of the regional forest still cover the islands. So just some decades ago, conservationists started to get worried about this because they understood that human activities were impacting wildlife, species of animals and plants. And they started to do something mostly regarding birds. So if you were walking in the middle of this rainforest, you will probably feel the humid environment. You will probably the ground will be probably wet all the time, and you will hear this type of sounds, a lot of callings from endemic birds that only exist there, and that sometimes they're very curious to understand who are you, why you are in my forest. But not only birds, they started to study also reptiles, such as this naja, which is a wonderful species of snake that is venomous mortal for humans, and I like to think that it's the guardian of the islands, because as people fear it, most people don't enter in the forest, so they don't modify it. But this species doesn't attack; it's actually very pacific. So if people started to study all these animal groups, what about land snails and slugs? So historically, we know that there is a great potential of species occurring in these mountains, in this forest. But not a lot of people were interested about their story. And especially, not a lot of people knew about the enigmatic ball giant snails, which is a species of African giant snails. Maybe you have already heard about African giant snails, because this family of snails, it's originary to Africa, but some of these species were brought outside Africa as pets or as people eat them. And eventually, they were introduced accidentally or deliberately in other environments, and they started to have a negative effect. But this species is different. This species only exists in these 2 islands. It probably originated from the smaller islands and then arrived on the others, and it's different from the other species on the continent because of its reproduction and ecological requirements. And we know from historical records that it was very common and very abundant around people, houses, rural communities around the forest, and then all of a sudden it started to disappear. So, as I told you, I deeply believe that for every species there is always somebody that needs to get interested about its story. Otherwise, it can disappear from the environment and nobody will ever understand it disappear because nobody even knew about their existence. So here we are for the first time. One of our first survey tried to understand if the species was still there, if it was declining and why. And it was actually very difficult because here we actually got stuck in the forest because eventually the river got very full and we couldn't cross. But during months we started to search for the species. And it was a difficult task because all what we could find was just this other species, which is an invasive species of also giant snails that was introduced at the end of the 80s from West Africa. And as people eat it a lot widely, they also introduced it all around the islands. So we only could find the introduced species, but there was no sign of this other of the bull giant snail that only exists on these islands. So we asked for help, and we asked to hunters and local guides to take us in the places where this species still existed. And we were also actually losing hope because everybody was like, yeah, it's very far in the mountains, but we don't really know where it's there. But then we would go there and it wasn't there. And finally, we find it. And it was a very emotional moment because imagine that you are trying to study a species during months just from historical records, and you finally have it in front of you, and it probably has never seen a human, and you are there, and you are acknowledging its existence. And however, even if it's joy at first, we were also very disappointed because we knew that all these efforts were ending in finding just some dozens of individuals of this species. So the species was declining very rapidly, and the causes of its decline was the destruction of and a modification of the forest, the introduction of these other small species I showed you before, and also people were harvesting this species. So at first we were kind of sad because we didn't know what to do now. Okay, we have some scientific data, but we should do something. We should act to do something. And we thought we were alone. But every time we were going back from the forest to the local communities around the forest, we would speak to people, and people would be very interested to understand what was happening to their snails. So this light in their eyes of interest make us understand that we had to do something now, because even if the species was disappearing from the forest, it hasn't disappeared yet from people's memory. So we could do something altogether. People were using this species. It has a cultural importance because it's used as medicinal, even if its effects are not scientifically proven, and as food. And the first things we did was to join people from different generations and try to create open debates. And this was a good strategy because elders and adults could see that the young generation didn't even know about the existence of the unique species that exist in the forest. And they only knew about the introduction, about the invasive species. So there was something changing in the traditional knowledge of the people, and adults started to get worried about it. So we thought we could use the story of this threatened species that was declining because of threats that were common among not only snails, but also other animal, mostly groups that were disappearing in the island. And to do so, we started to play also games. One of the biggest value in São Tomé and Príncipe communities is exactly the value of community. People acknowledge that they cannot live without each other. We need each other to survive. And this is the same concept in the forest. Species need each other to survive. And every time that the species disappear, this week of relationship among species, this net of relationship among species start to get weaken and weaken and weaken. And all of a sudden, the forest is weak, and it cannot stand the future of the forest, which is the future of the people as well, because they depend on forest resources for their survival. So they also suggested to start doing some actions, such as building a small center where we could study the species. We didn't know anything about its ecology, its reproduction. Was it possible to reproduce it in captivity? If it was disappearing so fast in the forest, can we help it outside of the forest as well? And also as a mean to aware other people, and mostly young generation, about the urgent need to protect the species. And as I told you, I was speaking with you about this giant species because it's the most appealing to speak about this animal group, which is land snails. People already knew it because of its charismatic value and cultural value, and because it was a charismatic species. But there, as I told you, there were other dozens of land snails and slugs, and almost nothing was known about them. So we started to learn more about these species particularly, but also other species of snails that occur in the forest. And working with taxonomists, as we first thought there were around 40 species of land snails and slugs on these two islands, we finally understood that there are 86 species of land snails and slugs, and 55 only exist in São Tomé and Príncipe. So they are endemic to the islands. And we also take advantage of while we were studying and protecting the species to show them to the to the young generation, and make them understand that we are never too small to make a difference, that they have a big role to protect the forest. Even if they are still young, they are very important for the future of the forest, from the smallest to the biggest animals and plants that live there. And with card games, 5 cents games, or animations, we try to understand what are the current knowledge and preferences for wildlife in children that live in these islands. And as well, we try to understand if through a card game, through drawings, their knowledge about the snails before and after meeting the snails, it's improving by analyzing the drawings of children. But so what can we do now to protect the species in the future? The collaboration, and so many people started to speaking about these species and other land snails species that before weren't almost noticed, started to be very exciting, and we started to have some workshop to try to understand what to do next with several entities. But even if conservation work is very exciting, and there is a lot of joy in working with nature and people at the same time, sometimes it's also challenging. And as a conservationist, personally, sometimes I fear I'm never doing enough, and mostly I fear that the work that we are doing is never fast enough as the speed of disappearance of species. And in one of our last surveys, we managed to get to the most remote area of native forest and those peaks there in the mountains. And we found that even if we found several endemic species, we found that a lot of individuals of bow giant snails were dead for what we think is a disease, maybe caused by the introduction of these other smaller species. So there are a lot of challenges, and at the end of the day, we always ask ourselves, why do we work for nature? So even if we have to get more and more information every day, and sometimes it's very challenging to try to put all together, we are working because we deeply believe that every single act that we do is doing some differences. Even if it's small, it's doing some differences in continuing the story of the species that are disappearing. And when I'm a little bit down emotionally, I like to think about the wonder in children's eyes when they, for the first time, look at the species that they will normally never meet, or they will normally never notice because it's small, and they start to wonder, they start to understand the beauty of this species, they start to understand their importance. And this is something each of us can do. We don't have to travel on the equator line in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean to do something. We can do it exactly now where you are. It's mostly if you are an educator or if you are a parent. You can just look around you and see the diversity of small living beings. Every living being, even if it's smaller, has its own characteristics, and you can show this to the other people around you or to your children and make them understand how relevant and how critical it is to do something right now for those species that are disappearing despite their size. So maybe this is an homework that we can all do at home, is to try to wear this different pair of glasses and try to find the beauty in every living being that lives around us, despite they are very different from us or they are very small. So thank you for your attention. My presentation is finished, and I would like to thanks a lot in behalf of the project teams, you that you were attending, and some entities such as Alisei NGO and the Lisbon University, and all those people and entities that in São Tomé and Príncipe are supporting us, and especially National Geographic that 3 years ago allowed us to start the project. And thank you so much.
Wow, thank you very much, Martina. That was that was very interesting, very informative. I love your message about big and fluffy popular mammals versus the not so popular but yet so pretty snails. Wow, it's the message is fantastic. We should really love and appreciate and work with every single creature around us. We should all be in balance. Please share your story of how did you fall in love with the snails? So you found the eggs, you were all surprised, and then what happened there?
So for these specific snails, actually, it's curious because I actually, when I was small, I got interested in these small in invertebrates, and then I started to have some of them in my house because I like to look at them and raise them, and also African giant snails, which is something we should actually be very careful about. As I told you, there are some invasive species, but I was trying not to reproduce them, just to look at them. And when I was studying in Lisbon University, and I told there was this species and almost nobody knew anything about it, and it was declining, I thought it was very, very curious that I was already in love with the African giant snails, and now there is a species that is just waiting for somebody to do something. So other people that around me were very passionate about diversity. We all got together and we started to do something about that.
Wow, that's fantastic. That's awesome. I too adopted some snails years ago, and I live in Moscow, so there's not a lot of natural habitat for the snails around. But so I adopted them. We had to help the poor creatures out, and they were so amazing. Just like you said, when you were talking in your presentation, I was feeling it myself. Yes, they're so different from us. They're not. You don't really relate to them as much as you do to big and fluffy popular mammals, like you said. But they're amazing. They're very social. I was surprised. I started talking to them, and it was like they were almost replying to me. They started moving because they hear the vibrance.
The vibration. Yeah, they hear the vibration, and actually you can really sort of interact. Of course, we try to see we would like to see from animals, but I see that there is some kind of interaction among us. And I don't know if you try to put a snail on your hand and it will try to scratch your hand, and you will hear really the sound of scratching. And they also have their favorite places where they live, where they sleep. It's really amazing to see them and see their tongue with thousands of teeth trying to scratch the food when you give them. I love it. So I understand.
Yeah. It's awesome. It's awesome. They have different tempers. They have their own likes and dislikes. They're just fantastic. And I wish, because I know what you're talking about, because every time I mention to anyone I know, my colleagues, my friends, that I have snails at home, the reaction was, what? What do you have at home? And I started speaking about these awesome creatures, and then you raise awareness and people start thinking about those, and how actually, just like you said, they're very, very important to the biodiversity. You should take care of all these species. You should know the challenges that they are facing. You should try to be an asset in any way possible. So thank you very much, Martina, for your great work. Thank you for your talk today. I do hope that some of the audience will go out and look for snails, or maybe try to interact with them, because they're pretty cool.
Thank you so much, Olga. Bye. Thank you so much to all of you. Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao. Have a great day.